Stephen by profession is an expert genealogist, and we're very excited to hear about the residents or past residents of Rhinebeck who now reside in the Rhinebeck Cemetery. So, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, David, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by talking about the chapel, which is directly behind us. And the chapel was built many years ago and served as a shelter for funeral services during inclement weather. It's referred to as the Adams Chapel, as Catherine Adams, who lived in the big white house south of the village green over in the village here at Rhinebeck on Montgomery Street, donated funds for it. In later years, the chapel was the site of the first Rhinebeck Museum of History, which was founded by the late town historian DeWitt Gurnell. A few photographs in the museum collection shows displays that DeWitt did in that building back in the 70s and 80s. In 1845, an ordinance was passed which prohibited burials in cemeteries adjacent to churches in the village of Rhinebeck. Henry Delamater of Rhinebeck was interested in starting a new cemetery. He selected grounds on the Post Road just south of the Landsman Kill, which is right over there. He gave much time and financial means to this cause. Henry is credited as the progenitor of the Rhinebeck Cemetery. A series of land gifts, including a half-acre in August 1853 from Miss Catherine Garrison for a cemetery for the people of color, was donated as well. Later, additional grounds on the Post Road south of the first gate were acquired, and the whole cemetery is known to be now a non-sectarian cemetery. Among those who laid out the bulk of the ground were Simon Welch, Edwin Hill, Virgil C. Traver, the funeral director William Carroll, and William Thompson. In 1898, a receiving vault was built for $950, which we will see down at the other end. Interments there were subject to a $5 charge, and bodies had to be removed before May of each year. In later years, the Chancellor Livingston Daughters of the American Revolution chapter here in Rhinebeck donated money to establish the fine gates on the south end of the cemetery on Mill Street. In recent years, the same chapter raised funds to restore the gates in Mill Road entrance, which were in need of repair to the south here. And why don't we start walking, and I'll go along the way and make quick stops and just very quick notations on some of the families. Here we are at the Kramer family plot. The Kramers are a family whose history I'm actually working on right now, and it's really a wonderful example of Rhinebeck's entanglement from the different genealogical families. Kramer Park, which includes several residential streets across from the Dutchess County Fairgrounds, including Kramer Road, was the family orchard owned by the Kramer family. The Kramer family had at least 3 historic family homes along the northern end of Montgomery Street. They grew apples and violets, as seen in copies of family photographs sent by Walter Taylor. Now, Walter is a descendant of the Kramers who lives in New Hampshire, and he and I have been working on a couple of books on the family. The last submerged baptisms in the old Baptist church, which is now Terrapin's Restaurant, where the lounge is. That's the older part of the church. In 1960 took place, and 2 young girls were submerged into the last baptism of that church, and one of them was Jennifer Taylor Clogston, whose mother is Doris Kramer. And right here we have Anna Kramer, the maiden aunt, Gertrude Pitcher, who was the grandmother, and William H. Kramer, the grandfather. They're right here in this plot. And then in the back you have the Cornelius connection, and across the way the Cornelius family. And what we're going to do is walk over here now to the Cornelius plot. Here we are at the Cornelius family plot. The Kramer family is directly related to this Cornelius family, and these are the same Corneliuses that own the Cornelius Funeral Home, which is now Dapson Chesney on West Market Street. The Cornelius house is located at 132 East Market Street, now owned by Brenda Klaproth and Paul Niederkorn, where they had the beautiful heirloom garden that Mrs. Cornelius, the former Violet Lown, was responsible for establishing. Mrs. Cornelius was an active member of Rhinebeck Garden Club for many years. Most of the Cornelius family is buried out in Milan Hill Cemetery in a very old plot on the easternmost corner of the graveyard. The Corneliuses were what I would consider Dutch Quaker. They belonged to the Milan Christian Church, which was torn down in the 1960s and was located directly across the street from the Milan Hill Cemetery. Just want to say that the whole connection with the Corneliuses goes way back to old New York City. This is one of our most undocumented important families. We know very little about them, and we're just unearthing it because of their connection to Harlem and the old farms in old New York. Here we are at the Brown Green Lound family plot. Several natives of Rhinebeck, now in their upper 80s, remember well an old widower affectionately known at their Sunday dinner table as Uncle Ed Brown. Ed Brown lived the life of a lonely widower for many years in what was later the Honey House on South Street, now owned by John Vincent and his family. These Browns are descended from General Pauling. Ed's mother was one of the 3 Green siblings, ergo the Green connection with the plot. And the Green siblings were raised by the noted William Kelly of Ellerslie. What happened was these young children, their father and mother died within a year, and they were left as orphans. And the way that the will read down in New York City was that Mr. Kelly, as executor, was to raise these 3 children. So at Ellerslie, he raised these 3 children with his wife, practically as their own. Ed Brown was a longtime member of the Rhinebeck Baptist Church and a close confidant of Reverend Lewis A. Mitchell, the pastor, for many years. Ed was extremely deaf and used to drive around town on Sundays in his convertible touring car with his quote-unquote female cousin. Uncle Ed used to have many Sunday dinners at the home of Mrs. Anna Hill in Rhinebeck, and that would be the octagonal house on Route 9 known as the Maples. And Edwin Brown is buried right here, Edwin Jr. And interesting that Edwin Brown Jr. married a Catholic from Poughkeepsie, which was very unusual in those days to marry into a Baptist family. So Ed was quite the character in town, and very well respected. And then the Greens and the Lowndes are all here in the same plot, so it makes it very easy to talk about. And directly across from us, we have the beautiful Blythe family plot. And I've talked to several people in town, and they say, well, who were the Blythes? And these are people that lived here their whole lives. And the Blythes happened to have the fanciest and the tallest monument in the Rhinebeck Cemetery. Mrs. Blythe was a Cowell. And we do know that the Cowell family home was immediately north of, the old Central Hudson building, which is now part of Rhinebeck Savings Bank. And where Montgomery Row 1 has the south parking lot was where the home was located for the Cowell brothers. And they were wealthy merchants. And the Cowells are descended from General Hooker from Connecticut. And they came to Rhinebeck again as part of that Connecticut Quaker migration that took place after the Revolution. So even though it's a family we don't hear much about, it's really one of our older English families. No visit to Rhinebeck Cemetery on a tour would be complete without talking about B. Cozine, who was a wonderful person who lived in Rhinebeck for so many years and did so much for Northern Dutchess Hospital. Mrs. Cozine was basically the administrator of the hospital for many, many years, and there were various elements of the hospital donated in her memory. And Cozine Field is where she and her husband Raymond, where they owned property on the south end of town off of Knollwood Road. She was a trained nurse and was administrator of what was then called Northern Dutchess Healthcare Center. A photograph we have in our collection at the museum shows Mike Mazzarella, B. Cozine, and Olive Bud Decker in the hallway of the hospital. Now, Will Tremper, who's also buried in the Tremper plot, is the man for whom Will Tremper Drive is named, where part of Stortini Village now stands. And Will Tremper was involved with many businesses in town and many civic efforts. So again, another one of our old families, and another family that we have many descendants still living in town, which is very nice. Howard Morse. And Dr. Morse for many years was the village physician, one of the main ones. But more importantly, Dr. Morse was a wonderful historian. And Dr. Morse is credited with writing the noted Rhinebeck Portrait of a Town, which was written in the 1910s and is probably still the preeminent final word on Rhinebeck history that we have today. He was definitely a beloved fixture in town during his day and is remembered by this very fancy monument. and he served in the Civil War as seen by the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, grave marker here. And next to him, we can do all of these families together. The Sherwood family. The Sherwoods are a very old family from Fairfield, Connecticut. They're one of the oldest families in Connecticut. They came to the colony of Connecticut right after the Mayflower. They were on the 3rd or 4th boat. And Sherwood Island in Fairfield County, Connecticut is named for Thomas Sherwood. And these are his descendants. Isaac Sherwood and his brother had a store in town, Sherwood's Groceries, many, many years ago. And the house that Chris Chesney lives in at South Street, the gray house, was the Sherwood House, and it's on the National Registry. So Sherwoods, again, part of that Quaker migration from Connecticut. And next to them, Shell and Miller family plot. Christian Shell owned the house approximately where the Episcopal Church now stands. He was a very old man in town on bank boards, lifelong Episcopalian, very philanthropic. And it just seems fitting that these three wonderful men who had so much influence in Rhinebeck should be buried together in the same section. I'm sure it was just happenstance, but that's, just one of the things that makes it interesting in talking about our cemetery. Here we are at the Strong Hill Fulton family plot. Many Rhinebeck residents will still remember former Rhinebeck educator Betty Strong, who was recently interned in the plot right here, actually, no more than a month ago. Betty was a former teacher in town. She came from Saugerties. Her in-laws are buried right here. Jacob Strong Jr., who owned the Rhinebeck Gazette at one time, and his widow, Shirley Strong, who died in 2004. So even though we're in the oldest sections of the cemetery, it's interesting to see that we're still using inurnments and internments in here. So when they planned out the cemetery, I think it was very wise. You can tell from the rows, there was enough room for the equipment many years later to even get in here. So that's good planning on the part of a cemetery. Betty's husband, Michael, was actually the last Strong family member to own the Rhinebeck Gazette. I want to make that point. And they are descended from Edwin Hill. And Edwin Hill, who's buried right here on this area, owned the livery stables. Now, these stables were the ones torn down when they made the commercial center in the village behind Bread Alone, adjacent to what used to be the hardware store. And on the north side of East Market Street. Descendants of this Rhinebeck family still live in the village, and many of their ancestors, including Edwin Hill, were associated with the Rhinebeck Reformed Church and the Church of the Messiah. And as you can see from these little markers here, 3 of the women belong to the Daughters of the American Revolution from the same family. They weren't necessarily didn't go in on the same person because they're daughters, and a couple of them are daughters-in-law, but they were still able to all be in the same chapter, the Chancellor Livingston chapter here in Rhinebeck, which is a nice testimony to the DAR to show that the old families are still active in town. The other thing I want to say is that the Kipps, Kramers, and Ashers, also very old Rhinebeck families, are united in the Strong family through intermarriage. So again, you see that interweaving of the roots of this very gnarled little town and how the families were, because it was a small town, marrying each other, as any other town would. The Hill family, I just want to make a point, this Hill family is not to be confused with the Hill family that reside at 72 Montgomery Street at the Maples, the octagonal house. That is more the Reid family, which we'll talk about later. A lot of people get the two confused. I just wanted, for prosperity, to make sure that that was clarified. And I do want to say the rest of the Hill family is buried in the village of Catskill, interestingly, where I'm a native. And there was a Hill jewelry store on Main Street, and there is still a Hill Street. And there are Hill descendants that live up there as well. So it's quite a large family. One thing we were able to do through eBay, I was able to purchase the family Bibles, which somehow ended up on eBay several years ago. And what I was able to do was take the information, do the genealogy, and then I'm happy to say I returned the Bibles to the family. They did not know that they were on eBay. So that the family here in town has those ancient Bibles, and also includes the Underhill family, which are the old Quakers, part of the Hill and the Strong family. And I do want to say that the Hill family, or the Strong family homestead, is what is called Violet Hill Farm on Violet Hill Road. It's that lovely early 19th century farmhouse that was totally restored a few years ago. As you're going down Violet Hill toward 9G, it's on your left up on that very steep hill, kind of a putty colored house. with eyebrow windows. And it looks like a Quaker meeting, and I think it was designed that way because of the Underhill connection. They were Quaker. We're going to move along behind us, those two obelisks. Here we are at the matching Du Bois family obelisks. The Du Bois family come from the old Huguenot Du Bois family of New Paltz. This particular line of Du Boises were from Fishkill, and they came to Rhinebeck, we believe, in the 1820s. Both brothers were successful, as seen by their monuments, one being a doctor and the other a merchant. Their blood relationship to the latter Du Boises, who still live in Rhinebeck, has not really been ascertained, although it's more than likely they are all descended from the same Huguenot pioneer from France. There was a Seth Du Bois in town who very early on owned a lot on Oak Street and was a local blacksmith. And it's interesting to point out that even though he was on Oak Street, which was where the black community lived, he was not a black person. So we had an intermingling of the two races. Many of the later family, like Mabel Du Bois, are buried at the Grasmere Cemetery. Many people remember Mabel. She was one of the washwomen who worked at the Thompson House, and she actually died at the Thompson House because she had resided there for many years. Mabel was very active in the hospital community as an employee there for a long time. So that's all I really want to say about that. While we're looking, we can see over there where the sun is shining the Radcliffe obelisk. And I'm just going to say briefly, the Radcliffes are descended from the Kipp family, and the house that's down in Hermansville, the stone house at that funny intersection where we had the Progressive Dinner a few years, is actually the house where some of those Radcliffes lived. And we were lucky enough by the descendants to be given a pair of oil paintings of Mr. and Mrs. Radcliffe, who are buried in that plot. So it's a nice connection to them. And we can continue on. Okay, the stone right over here that you can't really even read is the Fowkes family. And I can't find much on this family, even though it's such an old Rhinebeck family. What I do know about this family is that I actually personally know a woman who was married to a Fowkes who lived in Rhinebeck. She's now in her 80s, living in Florida. And she even tried to get her children to do the genealogy, and they could not connect how all these Fowkes came to Rhinebeck. So it remains a mystery to this day. When I was doing my research, I was very surprised to find an old Fowkes family plot here, only because there's an active Fowkes family plot at the Grasmere Cemetery, which was unfortunately used only a couple of years ago. And they have intermarried with some of Rhinebeck's oldest families, the Welches, the Scrivers, you know, a lot of old Rhinebeck families, but we just don't know much about this particular group. I want to talk also about the Teller family. The Tellers owned what was called Elmwood, which is that beautiful old house near the hospital that is still being restored. And it was also a family crypt was on that property where Thompson-Mazzarella Park is being developed. And the crypt is still there, but not used. The Tellers were moved to Rhinebeck Cemetery years ago. It's my belief that this stone used to be down there by the crypt.
Where's the crypt?
The crypt is on the Landsman Hill, right near the Star Library. There's that property that's going to be a park. There's an old vault down there that remains.
And I walk there all the time. I
yeah,
haven't seen it.
a lot of people don't know it's there. The kids do, unfortunately. They party in there. And pictures we have show there's been spray painting, beer parties, all sorts of things there. But anyway, the Teller family crypt was on the Landsman Hill, and many years later, some of the Tellers were moved here. The Tellers are an old family. Many of them are buried in Kingston at Wiltwyck Cemetery, and they are connected to the Rhinebeck Tellers. And their home, Elmwood, used to be what's also known as the Kirsten House. That's what I always call it, but other people call it Elmwood. The Teller family genealogy goes back to old New York City and Harlem, and I can get the Tellers back to about 1420 in the Netherlands. So it's really a very well-documented family, and there were a lot of Tellers, including some of them were doctors, down in Fishkill. So a lot of the Fishkill families I'm finding came to Rhinebeck. They would go back and forth. And it makes sense because Rhinebeck really was kind of a Dutch town, and Fishkill certainly was, so it makes sense the families had intermarried at one time. I'm also going to talk about the Shriver family, and their plots are all over. Matthew Van Buren Shriver is one of the men, and he was on the board of the banks, he was on the board of churches, the many efforts in town. The fire department he was instrumental in. And untangling the story of the Shrivers is probably one of the most difficult things I'm working on. Many name spellings have changed. Some people say it's Schneider, some say Shriver with an I, but many Shrivers who are descended from the old family of Rhinebeck are actually buried over in Port Ewan at the Riverview Cemetery. And again, we have this connection between the two sides of the rivers and the same families. And this has been going on since the early 17th century with some of these families. We do know that Matthew Van Buren Shriver was a very successful man and been on bank boards, involved with financial ventures in town, and at one time served on the Dutchess County Board of Supervisors. So it's worth noting him, and he was married, related to the Van Ettens, who are another old family in town. They owned, at one time, the fairgrounds. The old house, Springwood, was on the grounds there, and several of the old Hagedorns buried in this plot, and you'll notice around you there are Hagedorns, Coddingtons down there a little ways. A lot of these family members were removed from the old marble cemetery on 2nd Avenue in New York City, way back, I believe, before the Civil War. And they were brought back up here to Rhinebeck to be reinterred, and you'll see that down there. But these are the daughters of Garrett and Sarah Hagedorn Van Buren. Sarah is the one daughter, and the other daughter, Cora, and her middle name is Livingston. And the reason for that, Garrett Van Buren was Livingston's financial secretary here in town. And when Livingston died, Edward Livingston, the Van Buren family was able to acquire the rest of the fairgrounds as their private farm. And it was done kind of as a reward for him. I think it was really a token payment. It certainly wasn't what the property was worth even at that time. But it's interesting to see such an old plot here, and the people buried here were 1889, 1908. I mean, it's not as old as you would think it was. These are people that, because they were on the whole wealthy, some of the older siblings lived quite long lives. They had servants, freed black people, and descendants from this family, as late as the 1930s in Rhinebeck, were brought up with black help in the house. And we'll talk about that when we get over to the Reid family plot. We're just going to walk over. I do think it's worth getting the Hagedorn material. Okay, here we are at the actual Hagedorn part of the Van Buren plot. These are the ones that were brought here from New York City. The one woman I want to talk about is Jane Coddington. The Coddingtons are one of the oldest Quaker families from Nantucket, and the Coddington house is still standing. It's a 17th century house, and what's amazing, the descendants still own it. And I met the person there, I've been there. It's a beautiful shingled old whaling type of a house. Her husband, John Hagedorn, owned a lot of property, even in New York City. A lot of Brooklyn property, and a lot of new lots and areas like that. And then we have also here the connection with the Coddingtons of Asa Potter. Asa Potter was the father of Jane Coddington. Asa owned the Beekman Arms during the War of 1812. And the Coddington house is where the bank parking lot is. There used to be a strip of houses that ran right from near Stickles at the end of that little block, continued, and it went right through to where the liquor store is. Picture that all as buildings and houses. Asa Potter built a house there in about 1814 while he still owned the Beekman Arms. We know that for a fact. And there is a very old picture of the house at the museum. And what's interesting is that the house, even by like 1890 when this photograph was taken, the house even then looked like a retail establishment. It really didn't look like a house. And I've talked to the descendants about that, and they're trying to figure out, well, what other purposes did that house have? There was rumors that there might have been a funeral home there at one time. I've never found any records indicating that was used as a funeral home. But we do know later on it was Rosencrantz Sporting Goods, probably in the late 40s, early 50s. That was later where Rosencrantz was. But again, just the fact that some of these people were already interred in New York City and moved up here by horse and carriage. And at the end of the plot, I've talked to a historian, there's a little space. And there's a couple people who wonder if the family slaves are buried in this plot. I can't comment on that. All I can say is that's one of the theories that the family has, is that a couple of the family slaves are buried in this plot. Now, by the time they would have died, they probably were freed black as opposed to slaves.
Oh, then they can be buried.
Then they
could be buried legally.
Exactly, without any. But there's, and you notice also here, the Kip family, the Kramers, are all intermarried, these families. You go through the Rhinebeck Cemetery and try to really study how these people are related. And like Ada Harrison always said, Rhinebeck, 80% of the natives are Traver descendants. Don't talk about anyone because you might be related to them. And I think Ada summed it up very well. That is very true in our little community. But they're not all important. Okay, here we have the Kirsten Fraley family plot. There were 2 generations of Kirstens who lived in Elmwood, the old Teller house, and they were both physicians here in town. What's interesting is that Dr. Kirsten, the younger doctor, only lived to be in his 40s, early 40s. And I found on eBay and donated to the museum a memorial program for Dr. Kirsten. And it shows this very beautiful, fancy book that was done for his funeral, about 40 pages with black bunting around it, quite lovely. And it talks about how he's beloved by the townspeople, how he was the center of town. And his ancestors include the large Kirsten family from Saugerties and Kingston. Now, the Saugerties Historical Society headquarters is the Kerstin Homestead. It was part of his family. And also that it was built by Dr. Kirsten, younger Dr. Kirsten's great-great-great-grandfather. A lot of the Kirsten families buried over at Wiltwyck in Kingston, so we're very lucky to have some of them here. And of course the Fraley family, I'll mention briefly, we still have Fraleys in town, and many don't live in town, the native Fraleys, but they are in Florida and other states. We do know that the Fraley family was an early Palatine family. They came from West Camp, which would have been over north of Saugerties in the little community called West Camp, where there's a St. Paul's Lutheran church over there. And many of the early Fraleys are buried there, and then we do have some Fraleys buried up at what we call the Old Stone Church Cemetery, which was a graveyard for St. Peter's Lutheran Church here in Rhinebeck, that beautiful church up on the hill north of the 9G intersection. So again, another intermingling of old families with Dutch influence from both sides of the river. We don't really hear too much about our Dutch heritage in Rhinebeck because so much of it is so early. We don't have the documents to really tell as much as we should about it. So we're lucky in that even with the Palatine migration, happening in 1710 to 1716 approximately, that even that is early for a town. For New York State to be able to document your town as early as Rhinebeck can, we're really quite blessed. And people like Marilyn Hatch, Kay Verrilli, Ada Harrison, they worked for decades doing this. And Nancy Kelly, we're really grateful to them. I just want to say that to our audience. Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be going on the consortium website. That's going to help so many people. Here we are at Section E, unfortunately called Potter's Field, but we like to call it the Black Burial Ground. It is perhaps the most important section of Rhinebeck Cemetery. It's this Section E. It doesn't look very full from appearances, but there are a good number of people buried here without monuments and without marking. Several older natives recall wooden crosses in the 1930s and 40s marking the graves of some of these people. The remains of those crosses are long gone and the graves still are not marked. The best documented family here would be the McKinnon family down the hill here. The McKinnons were an old Rhinebeck family that lived on Oak Street. And what's neat is that their descendants have just put up a marvelous genealogical website about their family history, which is almost unheard of for a Hudson Valley black family. We're really lucky to have that. Mrs. McKinnon Sr., who is buried there, Evelyn, she's descended from a man named Joe Irvis. Now, I've done some research on this. Joe Irvis was a freed slave from Upper Red Hook. His children were baptized at St. John's Reformed Church in Upper Red Hook. So that's interesting. We really don't think of Upper Red Hook as having a black community, but apparently it had enough of it, because the distance to travel from downtown Rhinebeck to Red Hook, Upper Red Hook in those days for church, it would not have happened. So we know at one point the McKinnons were probably, or Irvises I should say, were probably living in Upper Red Hook. Many of their descendants live in the river towns of Catskill and Hudson, where there are literally hundreds of Irvises buried. And I went to school with about 30. My father and mother went to school with about 50. It's a very prolific family. And I just found out that right now in Catskill School District, there's about a dozen McKinnons, and they're all descended from these people. So it's a huge family, and something it's wonderful to see that the family's really taken an interest in their history. On a side note, Oak Street, unfortunately, was not considered a good section of town. Barbara Frost, who has since passed, told me a wonderful story. Somebody that worked for her mother at what they called the big house on Chestnut Street, where the Frosts lived, one night went home to her house, as she would do, and she would come back later to do the dishes for Mrs. Benson Frost, Sr. In the meantime, she sent her child back to the Frost house because there was trouble brewing on Oak Street. Now, this would have been back in the 30s or 40s, because the kids, Barbara and Benson, were still at home. They weren't at college yet. It's probably the late 30s. There was trouble on Oak Street. So it was suggested to them that they go find this gentleman in town. I'm not going to give his name because his descendants are still here, but he was a very influential person in town. And this gentleman walked up Oak Street, looked at the parties turned around, went back in their homes. There was no more trouble on Oak Street. That's how much influence someone from the bank in those days would have had. That all he had to do was walk up and down that street, and there was no trouble. So I think it's interesting. Dr. McAdoo from Vassar College, Brian McAdoo, and his team of students did some wonderful research here not that long ago, and the report is available. And they were able, through different motion sensor and heat sensor and topographical studies, to find many missing pods, as we call them, places where people are buried. So it's my hope someday that we can at least have small markers where the pods are, just to delineate where the burials are. They cannot use this section right now for any more burials, only because I was told years ago they went to do a burial and they hit someone's remains and they had to stop immediately. They couldn't use it. The back row, where you see those little stones, there's about 5 of them and then another 2. Those are people whose ashes were left at Dapson Funeral Home before it was Dapson Chesney. And it would have been when the funeral home was located across from the library in the big white house. It was there at one time, not that long ago actually, in the 70s and 80s. And when Dapson turned the funeral home over to Dapson Chesney, it's my understanding there were remains, ashes left on shelves that were never dealt with by family members. Maybe the people had no family. So some of those people at least have stones now. I don't know the whole story behind it, but that's what's in that back row. And then the Queen family and the Ackert family, they are old families in town, particularly the Ackerts of the Lutheran denomination and now the Reformed Church they belong to. They still use those plots. That section is still, little section is able to still be used for burials, and has been in very, very recent years, unfortunately, for the family. But that little area is able to be used. And there's one stone down here you'll see by itself by the name of Young. That's a Catholic family in town. There was a burial there 2 or 3 years ago. There's a little land there that they can use for a burial. But the middle, until they can mark these graves, they just gotta leave it alone. I could not justify doing a tour of Rhinebeck Cemetery or even the town of Rhinebeck without talking about Andrew Frazier. He served in the Revolutionary War as a freed black man and was George Washington's personal footman. That's big, the fact that we have someone like that buried here in Rhinebeck. Mr. Frazier lived to 102 years old. Now that's amazing in those days when they didn't have antibiotics and such, that he would have lived that long. Died in 1816, and his stone, for a member of the black community, is extremely ornate with the weeping willow tree. And it says right on there, was in the Rev War in 1776. So it's a wonderful documentation. Now what happened to this plot is amazing. These graves were removed by what was left of the family at the family homestead of Milan around the time that the Taconic Parkway was being bulldozed through in Milan. Research shows that the family lost the land. Until recently, we were not sure whether the remains were actually buried here of Andrew or if just the stones were removed. But Dr. McAdoo and his team was able to be very definite that Andrew Frazier is buried here. So it's quite, a tribute to Rhinebeck to have such a hero and such a unique story. I'm hoping someday someone will do a book on Andrew Frazier, because it would just be such a great gift for them to do. But you can see several generations of family. And our town historian, Nancy Kelly, told me a couple years ago, she remembers one of the Frazier descendants back in the 50s and 60s. They were still around Rhinebeck area. So that's, a wonderful thing too, that we would have had a black family in the Rhinebeck Red Hook area for as long as over, almost 200 years, if not more already. So it's a nice tribute to our town, I think, and a very important one. Here we are at what was known once as the Episcopal Cemetery. In the early days of Rhinebeck Cemetery, there was Episcopal, Methodist, and then, of course, when the Reformed Church graveyard got filled, there was a Reformed section here. Then when they became Rhinebeck Cemetery Association, it really became the non-sectarian, which is what most of our cemeteries are today. Over to our right here is the Salford family plot. And Mr. Salford was really the violet king. He brought the double Marie Louise violets to Rhinebeck. He's responsible for it, he and his brother. He and his brother William were the earliest cultivators of the English violets in glass greenhouses in America. Mrs. Salford, the former Louise Faust, was from Staatsburg, and her father was head gardener at the Locusts for the Huntington family, later the home of the first Mrs. Vincent Astor. The family ran the noted Salford Flower Shop on Cannon Street, which is now, unfortunately, a parking lot. Several publications on violets are being published in the next few months. One of them just was out today, actually. And it mentions an essay that was written on the Salford family. The last part of the Salford connection to Rhinebeck, the Chamber of Commerce used to have a Mr. Salford Planter contest back in the 2000, 2005, around there for a few years. And the merchants would do up pretty pots and window boxes in front of their establishments, and they would be given prizes, and it was known as the Salford Prize. So that was kind of the last legacy. I had the opportunity to talk to the last Mrs. Salford 2 years ago before she died, and unfortunately I think the family is going to do their own book. They're unwilling to share their information on.
So all the violets that are around here that proliferate,
yes.
So much, did I say that right?
Yeah.
That they originally came from England?
Many of them did.
And they're different from the wild ones.
They're different from the wild ones, but
I better stop somewhere and have a gander.
It's interesting. A couple weeks ago, the Salford plot was covered in violets. The little single Farquhar violets, which is what the last violet that the Trombinis grew, the blue ones. They were the ones that were the easiest. But many of our backyards do have the wild violets. What's interesting is that particularly on Platt Avenue, those little houses, like Dory Greeno lived at 30 or 32 Platt. When I used to work in her back garden, I'd be digging up glass all the time, every time I tried to plant a tomato for Dory, because of the greenhouses that were there. Her backyard was covered in the single violets. And I'm sure they weren't just the wild ones because of the violet houses being there. And many of the little sections on Mulberry Street, a lot of the little lots, have the violets that come up. So, I'm not really the best as far as identifying horticulture, although I am a good gardener. but I'm sure that some of those came from the greenhouse violets.
It just struck me funny that,
Yeah,
that
but most of them are the
imported
wild violets.
We have them growing wild all
Exactly.
over the place.
As a side note to the violets, we have the exhibit at the museum all season, Saturday and Sunday, 2 to 4. But the other thing that's interesting is that recently I sent 4 bouquets of violets, they're little tiny nosegays really, to a friend of mine who had taken a fall. And then she had surgery, and I called the florist in Red Hook a couple weeks later because she had a connection for the violets. It was so hot out in Northern California, where most of the violets are grown now, they never got the second crop this year. They didn't have violets for Mother's Day. And often in Rhinebeck, that would happen too. There were years it was so hot, they would never get the second cutting. They'd do well for Easter, but not for Mother's Day. And it was right around then I was placing my order, and they said, no, it was too hot up here in California. We couldn't get the second crop. So it just goes to show. But it's sad. Rhinebeck, we don't have a single violet house operating anymore. And even the anemones, we're down to none practically.
Oh, yeah,
So,
that was the other thing.
yeah, the anemones. We used to have a lot of that. So, but that's it on the Soffer family. The Quick family, who's buried here next to them, interestingly, also had greenhouses. North Parsonage, Mulberry, there were, and according to a descendant, Lindsay Madison, in an interview he did for the museum, there were also violet houses that the Quick family had, and later it was Trombini's who operated them, where the town hall is. Picture that as being violet houses. So that's kind of interesting. Right in the middle of town, these violet houses would pop up. Rhinebeck was called the Crystal City because from an airplane, all the glass would literally, you know, in the old days, the airplanes didn't fly very high, but coming in Cosine Field, they'd be blinded by the glass in the greenhouses. So it was the Crystal City, as well as the Parlor City, Violet Capital, all of that good stuff. Okay, we're just going to go.
The map?
Pardon?
Who has the map? Somebody has a map of where all.
We do at the museum. In the exhibit, there's a map of the village.
Yeah.
We don't have the map that shows Violet Hill in the greenhouses, unfortunately, but we do have the map for the village showing where most of the greenhouses were. That's a good point, Paul. Thank you. And of course, most of us are familiar with Daisy Sukley and her wonderful ancestral home, Wilderstein on the Hudson. And interesting, if you look over to the far end of the corner, you see 2 new stones in the Sukley plot. They did have a cousin who died back in February. Her funeral was from the Church of the Messiah, and she, Miss Hamlin, and she is buried there, as is her mother. And Daisy and her siblings are buried there, most of them. And it's quite a large plot. There's, I believe, 24, if I'm not mistaken, but there's room for more. And then we're just going to go over here a little ways. Here we are at the Reid family plot, and I hate talking about this plot because one of my best friends is going to be buried in this plot. Where to start? It's such an interesting family that we don't know much about. Tom Reid Sr. and his son Tom Reid Jr. were both early stock traders on Wall Street, and they had their own firm. They lived, the Reid House is the large octagonal house at 79 Montgomery Street in the village, and now known as 6484 Montgomery. Tom Reid Sr.'s son-in-law, who's buried in this plot, Reverend Lewis A. Mitchell of Buffalo, became minister of the First Baptist Church of Rhinebeck, which is now the Terrapin Restaurant on Montgomery Street. His daughter, Anna Mitchell Hill, married Mr. Harry H. Hill Sr. from an old South Carolina cotton-producing family. Now, it gets complicated because Harry Hill Jr., who most of the old-timers in town remember, was the attorney. And Harry is credited with bringing attorney Bob Marvin to Rhinebeck, and also was the protege of Mandeville Tom Frost, who just died. Harry Hill clerked on the Nuremberg trials. There's a wonderful book that should be written about Harry Hill. He was there when they were trying all the war crimes over in Europe after World War II. And he later developed an early tourist area on the Hawaii Islands with several other investors, now known as Waikiki Beach. To think that this man from Rhinebeck, little old Rhinebeck, did this. And his sister always says to me, if he lived longer, he could have been president. And I used to say, yeah, sure. I'm starting to think she was right. The Hill law offices were in the former Teeter building on Montgomery Street, now H.H. Hill Realty. His widow remains in the family home in Rhinebeck. The other building that they owned was what was before that, the Women's Exchange, the beautiful building with the columns and it looks like the little Greek temple, that's also one of the Hill family buildings. And that has been painted, but underneath the paint there are Olin Dow's murals that someday will be able to be restored. They're being preserved by a layer of paint, I'm told. The latest burials in this plot are Mr. and Mrs. Harry Hill Sr.'s youngest daughter, Lucille, whose grave is right there. She died in 2010 in Connecticut. She was the youngest of the children. And also right next to the Reid headstone, Tommy Schoonmaker, who was a wonderful person who died unexpectedly up in Barrytown where he lived. So this is still a very active plot, even though it's one of the oldest in the Episcopal Cemetery. There are still graves open in this plot, and I think the reason they fit so many is that this generation is being cremated to make the most out of the space. The Reids are descended from the noted Reverend Robert Scott. His grave will be the last one on the tour. Earlier, I was talking about the 3 Green siblings that were raised at Ellerslie by William Kelly. This is William Kelly's grave. William Kelly was a New York State Senator and the original proprietor of the estate Ellerslie on the Hudson, located on Morton Road. Mr. Kelly and his wife raised the 3 Green siblings as their own. One of the orphans was the mother of the Brown family on South Street. Ellerslie was later purchased by Vice President Levi P Morton, who is also buried in the cemetery, and we'll see his grave. And after that, Ellerslie became the Cardinal Farley Military Academy. And after that, pious services from the New York Archdiocese. So it's got a very long history. And I just want to quote William Kelly very briefly. On September 5th, 1860, from Rhinebeck, William Kelly wrote a letter to the nomination committee. He was nominated unanimously to run for governor of the state of New York by the Democratic Convention assembled at Syracuse. He says, quote, "In reply, I beg to say that I accept the nomination with a high sense of honor and with profound gratitude to the great party which has conferred upon me so distinguished a mark of its favor and confidence. As this nomination was not sought by me, so it is now accepted only upon a belief based on assurances which have been warmly made to me that the use of my name will tend to, quote, unite the great body of the democracy with a capital D and the opponents of sectionalism in this state," unquote. So he was a very educated man making a statement like that and very brief, unlike our politicians today. And that's all I need to say on William Kelly. We'll move on to Levi Morton and some of the other people up on the hill here. We're at the grave of Vice President Levi P Morton. I'm not going to go on and on, even though it's nice and cool here. I will say Morton was born in Shoreham, Vermont. So that's very much a little farming community. His father was a minister of the Congregational faith, and he's from very hardy old New England stock. And we have a wonderful collection in the picture in our collection at the museum. It shows all the Republicans in Rhinebeck, and there were quite a few at that time. I want the people today to know we did rule at one time, and it shows him with a large group of Republicans at Ellerslie in 1888. It's great because the photograph is not only dated, Barbara Frost's grandfather, Mandeville Frost, is in the photo. So there were actually Rhinebeck people who knew Levi Morton very well. He was not an untouchable or unapproachable man. He was actually very much part of the Rhinebeck community. Ergo, Morton Hall and many other things. He was asked to be appointed minister to Britain or France, and was United States Minister to France 1881 to 1885, which is actually quite a long time for that kind of an assignment. Morton was very popular in France. He helped commercial relations between the U.S. and France run smoothly during his term. And in Paris, October 24th, 1881, he placed the first rivet in the construction of the Statue of Liberty. That surprised me. I had no idea. Yeah, so I thought that was really cool. He was governor of New York State 1895 and 1896, and was considered for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1896, but they chose McKinley instead. After public career was over, Levi Morton became a real estate investor. He died at Rhinebeck on his 96th birthday. I didn't realize how wealthy Levi Morton was on a national level. Levi Morton owned property in Newport, Rhode Island, and lived on the Tony Bellevue Avenue in the mansion called Fairlawn. I've been to that house. He left a nearby property to the city of Newport to use as a park. At the corner of Coggeshall and Morton Avenues stands Morton Park. Morton sold and donated property he owned in Hanover, New Hampshire to Dartmouth College, and the college built Webster Hall on that land. He was considered an honorary alumnus and was very active in Dartmouth affairs. He owned a summer retreat in the Adirondacks on Eagle Island, and the architecture of the great camp style is very noted by his architect there, William Coulter. Over the years, Eagle Island has turned into ownership by the Girl Scouts of America, and his property is now Camp Eagle Island. The Crosbys, as many of you know, owned Grasmere at one time, not that long ago. And I tried to do research on Munsell Crosby, and unfortunately I couldn't find that much. I was really surprised. But he's perhaps best known locally of all the Crosbys. At age 14, he was a knowledgeable bird watcher and worked under the guidance of Ralph Waterman. So for locally, that's a very big deal. He later published a well-respected inventory of bird life in Dutchess County, and his vast collection of fossils, butterflies, and other artifacts have been donated to the Natural History Museum in New York City. So a wonderful person. What's interesting is that in this plot, all the little footstones and even the headstones is more of an Episcopal type of a cross. And you see here that there's recently been a burial in 2009 in the Crosby plot, and there is still a burial to take place, hopefully not for many years, of another Crosby family member. Here we are at the Oblensky/Astor family plot. Alice was the daughter of Colonel John Jacob Astor and sister of Vincent Astor, and she married Prince Sergei Oblensky. They married July 24th, 1924 at the Savoy Chapel in London. The marriage was considered to be the event of the social season of England that year. They resided at a mansion she had built on River Road near her brother, which she called Valor. Alice's home was designed by Harry T. Lindbergh, who also designed Rhinebeck's Box Hollow for the Dowes family. A marvelous photograph in the museum collection of 1928 shows the mansion under construction in its early stages. We also found, thanks to Kay Verrilli, papers that actually show electricity, how Vincent used his influence to get Alice electricity into Valor, when most people in Rhinebeck didn't have electricity. How he used his influence to get her the building materials that she needed, because it wasn't that long after World War I, things were still not that plentiful in the manufacturing. He was able to pull a lot of strings locally for his sister so that she could complete this home. The latest burials in this plot are just from a few years ago. And it's very interesting that the family continues to come back to Rhinebeck. And there are distant short-tail relatives, Tiskevich, who do live in the town of Clinton still. And there's some other Tiskeviches that used to live in Rhinebeck that now live in Florida, who I know. So it's very much an interesting family. I've read the book that the prince wrote, and his story is really quite interesting in how close he really was to the royal family that was murdered, over in Russia. So the fact that they're all expatriates, and the gentleman buried there, Philip McMahon, he was actually a friend of Mr. Oblensky, who is still living, not the count, not the prince, his son the count. Philip and the count were on the board of the old soldiers' home down in New York City, which is actually a very beautiful establishment. And Philip, when he died in 1999, there were 8 people who came up from New York City. His funeral was at Campbell's, which anyone knows the city is the most prestigious funeral home probably in America, and the wealthiest. And he wanted to be buried with his friends, the Oblensky. So a lot of people have said to me, who is this McMahon in the plot? Well, that's who the McMahon is in the plot, a very close friend of the family. Here we are at the Dowes family plot. And the internationally known artist, Olin Dowes, is buried right here. Olin Dowes, many of you know, is muralist because he did the murals in the Hyde Park and the Rhinebeck post offices. The other thing that Olin Dowes did, which was so great, during the war, he was over in Europe and he would paint and sketch and document battles and different military tactic training that was going on. There's the Military Museum down in Washington, D.C. has a marvelous collection of Olin Dow's material. We're very lucky we have copies of prints that were made at the museum, which we haven't used, unfortunately, but we will someday to show them. And here we have Alice Dow's, Olin and Tracy, and Deborah's father. And here we have Tracy Dow's. Tracy Dow's was quite interesting. He was very active in Rhinebeck, bank boards, electric company, water company, the churches, donated very, very generously. The other thing that's nice about the Dow's family, the Rhinebeck Historical Society and the museum, we both have different parts of a collection of glass negatives and family photos. Recently, unfortunately, Deborah Dow's home did burn. We're finding, though, that some of the material was saved from the fire, including some Olin Dow's paintings, small little paintings that were not framed. And we're very lucky that the Rhinebeck Historical Society has agreed to take on the stewardship of storing them for the Southlands Foundation, so that these will be preserved, and they're being worked on by an art historian who I know and has great training in the field. And I'm very excited. Brenda Claproth and I worked, Ada Harrison, a few other people, on trying to at least catalog what was there. So if things were lost in the fire, at least we know what was there. They've been put on a database. The database is accessible to the public through the Consortium of Rhinebeck History and their website. Deborah Dow's was an amazing horsewoman. The thing that's so great about her, she had the guts as a woman to go to Europe right after the war, the 50s, and she took training that was so intense in Austria and a couple of other countries on proper stewardship with horses and riding horses the proper way. And she was one of the few women that were at a couple of these internationally known schools. And she took that knowledge back to Rhinebeck. She formed the Southlands Riding Foundation, and it's a very worthwhile cause that has helped many children and young adults appreciate their equine animals and how to properly ride. We used to have a very active pony club in Rhinebeck, and Southlands has really been part of the core, not only historically but socially, of the Rhinebeck community. So we're very lucky that we have the Dow's plot here in Rhinebeck, and a lot of their history has been preserved. Here we are at the Garrity family plot. And this young gentleman, Thomas H. Garrity, I say young, he was born in 1907, died in 1932. He lost his life in a fire. He was a volunteer fireman here in Rhinebeck. And there was a little story in the paper not too long ago. They're trying to find any descendants of him to get their approval to put his name on the New York State Volunteer Firemen's Memorial at the Empire State Plaza in Albany. Oh. So it's worth noting he gave his life, and unfortunately, you know, that's what happens with our firemen. They take a risk. Next to that is the Shad family plot. And most people who have lived here for a while in Rhinebeck will remember Shad's Meat Market. They were a fixture in town. From what I was told by the old timers, definitely a bone of contention, what friend did you call when someone died? Because it's a small town, you knew both of them. The way it often ran for many years, White got the Catholics, Dapson, which took over Carroll, they got the Protestants. So that was really how it was done in many ways. And back then, the funerals, many of them were done out of the home. That's why Mr. Carroll's location, many of you would say, well, that's a weird place for a funeral home, that retail space. But he probably did not use the retail space very much except for consultation and for the embalming room. He probably didn't have funerals there. As late as the 1960s, I know people in town who had funerals here in Rhinebeck in their parlors. So it's just an interesting side note. But the Grubes are an old German family. The nice thing about Andrew Grube, he also made furniture. Both of these funeral directors were cabinet makers. Surprise. And so what they would do, you'd buy a piece of furniture, but often their furniture is labeled on the back, either with a sticker, and hopefully the sticker didn't fall off, but the older pieces, like Andrew Grube, would just paint A. Grube, Rhinebeck, New York. We're very lucky we have a family in Connecticut that's given us a dry sink. That's an Andrew Grube piece. And the Grubes are a German family, and there's 3 Grube plots here in town. It was in the cemetery. It was a big family at one time. And that's it for this section. We're going to move on. I do want to mention way in the back, and we're not going to walk way back there, unfortunately, Lorena Hickok, Eleanor Roosevelt's companion, quote unquote, is buried. And it's interesting, the people who own the property in back of the cemetery, right there, that white house, it's believed that Miss Hickok, part of her is on their land, the way that the grave was dug. Lorena Hickok was a wonderful news journalist and very close confidant of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was born in 1893 and died May 1st, 1968. She resided at Valkill part of the time and was part of the inner circle there. She left home at age 14 to work as a maid until her mother's cousin took her in. She finished high school, enrolled in Lawrence College in Appleton, Wisconsin. She dropped out after 1 year, as many of the press people have done. They wanted to travel and cover stories. And she was hired by the Battle Creek Evening News in Michigan. She went on to work at the Milwaukee Sentinel, then in Minneapolis and New York City. Very, very successful at the time for a woman to have that kind of a newspaper career. She met Eleanor Roosevelt summer 1928 at the National Democratic Convention, headquarters in New York City. In 1932, she convinced her editors to allow her to be the main person to cover Mrs. Roosevelt. She became executive secretary of the Women's Division, the Democratic National Committee. And after FDR's fourth inauguration, she lived at the White House. Now, I didn't know that. I don't remember the books talking about that. During her time there, her nominal address was at the Mayflower Hotel, where she met most people. During this time, she formed an intense relationship with Marion Janet Herron, a United States tax court judge, and that became basically her lover. She was basically the only person to visit her at the White House, where she lived. When Hickok's diabetes worsened in 1945, she was forced to leave her position at the Democratic National Committee, and Eleanor helped her obtain a position with the New York State Democratic Committee 2 years later. She lived in a cottage on the Roosevelt estate, where she died in 1968, and as I said, is buried in the far corner of the cemetery, partly on someone else's property. So that's for that one. Just to talk very quickly about a couple of the families over in this section that you're looking at. The Bucciones, or Bucciones, are a very old Italian family. Their plot's just down a little bit. You'll see it as we move on. They had a little candy store not too far from Stickles 5 and Dime. It was later called Funk Candy Store. It was the Guilfoyle family is also buried near the Bucciones. They're an old Rhinebeck family, and they are in this section. And then the other family I want to mention briefly are the Ficaras. Mr. and Mrs. Ficara owned a little shoe repair business, which was where at one time, presently Merriweather's on Montgomery Street, that very tiny little retail space, was Ficara's shoe store. A few years ago, Mike Ficara of North Dakota recalled in his memoirs that the family lived over that business on Montgomery Street. A photograph from the George Hull scrapbook in the museum collection shows Mr. and Mrs. Ficara Sr. in front of their business in 1945, posing for the camera and wishing George well as he was serving in the military. Their son Mike Ficara and his widow Rita just died last year and were inurned in the urn garden facing Route 9, less than a month apart. Mike was very proud that he was the son of an Italian immigrant who received a formal education and became an officer of the Rhinebeck Savings Bank. Whenever I talked to him, he was very proud of that, the fact that he was from one of the few Italian families in town, and that he had done so well for himself and made his parents proud. I think that was probably his greatest achievement, was being able to do that, so I always thought that was neat. We're at the site of the Huntington family plot. This is the final resting place of the former Mrs. Vincent Astor, later Mrs. Lytell Hull. She's buried here with her second husband, Lytell. Her patriarchal family home was the Locusts, as shown in several postcards from our collection. The Rhinebeck Historical Society had a wonderful event there not that long ago. The house was later bought by Robert Guccione Penthouse and later sold. The area known as the Quadrangle is part of the estate, and the Quadrangle is immediately off Route 9. It's a series of buildings and houses that Mrs. Hill had built for help, chauffeurs, farm workers, gardeners, etc. Later, the buildings were redecorated, and guests of hers, such as Andy Warhol and his infamous factory, and friends of hers from different art groups, used to stay there for periods of time. Basically, Warhol ruined the Quadrangle, is what I was told by many people down there, with crazy things going on. Mrs. Hull was the largest donor to the Metropolitan Opera in New York City in her day. That's the kind of money we're talking about here. This wonderful photograph we have showed her at the peak of her influence, and she was friends with the most interesting people, internationally known violinists, playwrights. She was really a woman of letters. Her estate was left to benefit many worthwhile internationally known institutions, including the Opera and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Also with her is the Ford family, which is part of her immediate family. Members of that family, include her niece and nephew, still remain on part of the Locusts in Staatsburg and continue to reside there. And we'll move on. We're at the site of what I call the Bound Sands Burial Ground. And I call it that because the late town historian DeWitt Gurnell always claimed that this series of graves, not only the tall stones, but these few here, were removed from another family cemetery east of the village, almost right on Route 308. Nancy Kelly, our town historian, had told me that Gurnell believed there was a private family burial ground between the corner of Cedar Heights Road to Rock City. So somewhere in those flat lands, which was, some of it was owned by this family, apparently there was a family burial ground. A collection of letters, surveys, and legal documents in the museum collection gives us a small look into this family. An article written by Nancy Kelly and research with my assistance is being published in an upcoming Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook. The Sands family represents a long line of Quakers and Episcopalians from Sands Point, Long Island. This grouping of the family founded St. Anne's Episcopal Church of Flatbush, Brooklyn, and memorial windows in that church still remain. They maintained a home in Brooklyn and used Rhinebeck as their weekend and summer residence. During the Revolutionary War, some of the Sands family had been Tories. Rhinebeck resident Jim Cater's line of the Sands family buried their silver and gold on the beach at Sands Point, Long Island, and they went north to Canada during the Revolution. After the war, they returned, dug up the loot, and returned to Canada. Part of that family founded the noted McGill University in Canada. Joan Hull of Rhinebeck, another Quaker and descendant of the Sands family, is descended from Reverend David Sands of Milton, the noted abolitionist and Quaker minister, who operated the ferry between Milton and Poughkeepsie. This is all part of what I'm trying to prove with the Underground Railroad. Did Reverend Sands from Milton have any connection to abolition in Rhinebeck with this part of the Sands family? That's my hypothesis, that there was some sort of connection because they're both river towns. Rhinecliff always had docks. There was Slate Dock, Upper Dock, the old Rhinecliff Dock. There was access to the river, which was quite good in Rhinebeck, for anyone that needed to do the Underground Railroad and get in the boat and go up to Kinderhook and then go from Kinderhook out to Western New York into Canada to get their freedom. That's the hypothesis that I've been working on for several years, is trying to prove this. It's interesting to note that Daisy Sukley is descended from this group of Bound and Sands family. The Bound house burned down a number of years ago. It was located when you come off Route 9G to Rhinebeck. It was located on that little road, Crow Hill. It was later a school that the Fraley family ran. And the only thing, unfortunately, that we have left, there's a few archival pieces at Wilderstein, and we have at the museum, thanks to Wilderstein, on loan, a table and 2 chairs that came out of the Bound house. We don't know, we can't prove anything right now in Rhinebeck about the Underground Railroad. We know there are houses in town that have shackles in the basement that have been found. We surmise that the Baptist Church was probably part of the Underground Railroad or the Reformed Church, but we can't prove any of it. But it's quite nice to have such an important family that so few people know about, buried here in Rhinebeck. And I hope when people hear this, they'll think a little bit more about that. Rhinebeck was not just Dutch, it was not just Palatine, it was Quaker, it was English. There were a whole bunch of people. We just don't know a lot about them, and we have not really documented their history. There's one more visit we're going to make toward the front, and then we're done. I think this is probably one of the top 3 most important plots in town, in this cemetery. This represents what was the Baptist Cemetery. It was located in the Terrapin parking lot. When it was moved, a long, long time ago. What I can tell you about Reverend Scott is very interesting. He was a cabinet maker by trade from England who came to America, and we actually have the date, October 6, 1794. And he worked for General Morgan Lewis on Leonard Street in New York City as a carpenter. His home was on South Street in Rhinebeck, and he ran an academy out of it, which he started in 1796 at the urging of Margaret Beekman Livingston. He became a merchant, which he remained for 4 years. After that, he opened a boarding school and remained a teacher and surveyor most of his remaining life. He entered the ministry in 1821, organizing the First Baptist Congregation of Rhinebeck on July 4th of that year at age 60. For our public's information, the gray house with the pillars on the south side of East Market Street, just east of Parsonage, east of Parsonage, I've been assured by numerous sources, is not the Robert Scott House. That was another school at one time run by an entirely different person. I made that mistake, and I had a very good source in my friend Barbara Frost, who told me, "You're not the only one, don't feel bad, but that's not the house." There are 2 pieces of furniture, both lowboys, that exist to this day, which were handmade by Reverend Scott here in Rhinebeck. One is owned by a male descendant of the Scott family who still lives in Rhinebeck and inherited it from his grandmother on Montgomery Street. And she was the original owner. The other, a mate to it, is owned by a woman in Virginia who has promised to donate it to the museum upon her death and bring it back to Rhinebeck. So that's kind of cool to have a nice formal piece of furniture that someone from Rhinebeck made. Reverend Scott and his wife were buried in a small burial ground where the parking lot of the Terrapin restaurant is, as that was the First Baptist Church. They were removed from that location many years ago and reinterred to this current site, as were the other people from that burial ground. Reverend Scott's son-in-law was Garrett Van Kuren of Springside in Rhinebeck, and his grandson-in-law was Thomas Reid Sr. from the Wall Street firm Reid & Reid. Reverend Robert Scott died at 74 on September 24th, 1834, at his home in Rhinebeck. And that concludes our tour. Thank you.
Thank you.